But you know the thing of a successful podcast, Ben?
What's that?
You have to say something you feel deeply uncomfortable with at the end of it.
Max Linsky told me that, and it's I know. Oh, I feel like I'm already on, like, 3, and we've barely gotten rolling.
Oh, excellent.
I'm Ben Smith,
I'm Nayeema.
and this is Mixed Signals from Semafor Media.
Today we're diving headfirst into election season. It is here. How do you feel about it, Ben?
I mean, I've been covering these for 20 years, and I have to admit I kinda love it.
You're like a media monster. It's like happy when there's crisis. Oh, more coverage.
Yeah, that's a real occupational hazard.
It is. We're going to run down the presidential debate, which is also known as, I guess, a wellness check on the geriatric Trump-Biden rematch. And we'll focus in on one of the stranger conspiracies of American politics, that there's this real feedback loop between political coverage, in particular polling, and the actual behavior of campaigns or voters. They're not mirrors, they're drivers of what happens. And as part of this, we're going to turn to Nate Silver, who's the founder of 538 and now prints under his Substack, Silver Bulletin. And Nate is seen as so much as the guru of this world that when he put out his new predictive model on Wednesday, it prompted a premature victory lap from one of Nate's apparent devotees, Donald Trump.
We're leading every swing state, and what just came out, I guess, Nate Silver, the New York Times, that we have close to a 66% chance of winning, which is a pretty good chance, I guess, when you think about it, right?
And Mr. President.
That's tape of Donald Trump calling into a black barber shop in Atlanta where Trump supporters, including some black members of Congress, were gathered. And thanks to Semafor reporter Kadia Goba, who was in the room, we actually have that tape.
Classic Trump in many different ways, including saying that Nate Silver worked at the New York Times.
Not factual anymore.
No, but obsessed with prestige and the most
Yes.
prestigious media brand he can drag into this thing.
Oh, we're going to have to ask Nate Silver about that when we talk to him. So we'll do that, and then we will take a look at blind spots, the stories you're not seeing in your feed of viral debate clips. All right, here we are. It is 11 p.m. Eastern time almost, and we have just finished watching the debate. I'm here, Nayeema. Ben, you're here with a new haircut.
Yeah, mid-episode.
Did you get a debate haircut?
Gotta be ready.
Got you ready. And then Max Tani is here. Hi, Max.
Ben's haircut is the biggest news of the night for sure.
It is. Let's set the stage a little bit. Where did we all watch the debates? Maybe Max, you can go first.
I watched it here in the basketball stadium at Georgia Tech, which is where the spin room is.
Is it the most exciting thing that's ever happened in that basketball court, or by a long mile not?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty good basketball team that plays here occasionally, but it is actually, it's pretty exciting. There are a lot of people here. There's 800 credentialed journalists, and they're all kind of going down onto the floor. So it's starting to feel a little hectic and crazy.
June Madness, they call it. And Ben, where do you watch?
I watched it home with family on my YouTube TV.
Oh, Ben.
That's all I got. Nayeema, where did you watch it?
I watched it in probably a strange room. I'm in the house of a friend who's a tech founder. I watched it in an election watch party with about 50 people. I would say probably about 60-40 Biden Trump in this mix, or maybe like it's one of the few rooms that I guess has that kind of diversity. There are a lot of like tech founders. There are a lot of kind of maybe liberal creatives and executives around in New York. And then there's like beautiful women, many of whom happen to be one of the first two categories as well.
This was like Frank Luntz, but only talking to billionaires. I love it.
No one's disclosing the incomes of the people in this room. But it's fascinating to watch. Like during the intermission, everybody started speaking about their aging parents or grandparents.
Hmm.
So let's figure out, like, we all watched this debate, played out for 90 minutes. Everybody talked about hate watching it. It was a kind of, geriatric wrestling match, whatever they wanted to call it. But there's a tradition where somebody decides who won the debate, and they decided at a certain moment in time. And Ben, I think you have actually done that honor before in 2012.
Yeah, I got this was back when Twitter was new, and the notion that you could that things were accelerating was still also new. And it's early but 45 minutes into a presidential debate, I published an article on why Romney had beaten Obama in the first debate, which got me widely denounced. But in a way was my meta commentary on the acceleration of these debates. I mean, this one I think was much more accelerated, though.
This one, you could have published that story within 5 minutes, and I don't think anybody would argue with you.
When was the moment you think it was decided, and who decided who won the debate?
I think paying attention to the media coverage, sitting here in a room full of 800 members of the media, I think it was decided very, very quickly. The moment that got the loudest audible kind of chuckle or reaction in my section of media with several dozen people was when Trump said, "I don't know what he said there" at the end of one of his answers. And I think that really summed up a lot of people in the media's feelings about it.
The moment that we're talking about happened around 9:22 p.m., where Donald Trump said, "I don't know what he said" at the end of that sentence.
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. Look,
I think the thing with this sort of debate is that the journalists watching, certainly, I think within that first 5-10 minutes, which Trump basically summed up there, but included Biden just kind of glitching for a few seconds and forgetting what he was saying, staring down, and broadly just looking as old as Democrats feared he would look, as hesitant after a week of rehearsals as anybody could have feared. And I think the thing is, then maybe the debate is still going and these two guys are arguing about their golf games, but what has already happened then is there's headlines in every publication, the stories are being written, the narrative has taken off, and the narrative is that we're heading into a huge crisis for the Democratic Party. I mean, this
Yeah.
is a massive new crisis for them.
I have to say, like, it's the question of like who won this debate is almost not a good question. It's like who lost this debate less.
Yeah, I mean, it really pretty remarkable. 'Cause I watched a lot of debates where it was not this clear, and where the narrative did not lock up in the first 10 minutes. And this isn't, this wasn't just the media watching it. This was anybody who was watching it. And it was at a moment when we'd all been, I think, spent a lot of time getting scolded by the White House and for daring to raise questions about his age. And so I think there is, along with just everybody having watched a debate in which an old man struggled to hold his own there. There's also a sort of we're like sick of getting yelled at about writing stories about his age, and you're seeing some of that too.
The idea of where you call it also, I mean, Twitter is a place, and it's certainly a place where the media pays a lot of attention to. I was also following on Instagram, TikTok, and the betting markets. The betting markets at Bovada and also Polymarket. You started seeing as early as the first few minutes, as soon as Biden walked in and then Trump walked in, that's when it started dropping. You know, started like the race started much higher. It was like odds were 225 up for Joe Biden, and it ended at 275.
Did you see something different on those places than we were seeing on Twitter? That sounds like kind of a reaction to Twitter. Was any of the social media moving in different directions? Was anybody saying, "Wow, Biden's great"?
I didn't see any of Biden's great, but I did see some kill shots of Trump, the muted mic shot at 9:21 p.m., which was like a minute earlier than Biden's kind of what some people were terming on social media as freezing, or what Trump called out as unable to finish his sentence. And then at I think 10 minutes earlier than that, when Biden stumbled over trillionaires instead of billionaires and billions of dollars. There were a couple of like missteps in the same minute. That's when I heard the most audible gasp. And that's when I think people kind of made up their minds across the room.
Yeah, it is interesting though, because I think that like in so many political contexts, like what people think and the sort of more populist sort of TikTok, Instagram, what's happening out there matters a lot. I think in moments like this, the elite consensus matters a lot. And what you had was a sort of like crystallization of that elite consensus tonight.
One of the things in the betting markets was the odds on there being another candidate. And that also, I think, is reflected in the media. But over the course of the hour and a half of the debate, it went from about 10% odds of there being another candidate other than Biden to almost 20% odds. So doubling.
The reason why the elite consensus matters in this case is because those will be the people who will be able to potentially pressure Biden to get out if that's still an option, if he still believes that that's an option after this debate. And I think that what you're seeing for the first time is, rather than it just being a handful of small commentators here and there, people like Ezra Klein or David Axelrod, who've taken a lot of flack for calling on Biden to potentially, step aside, or for the Democrats to consider someone else. I think what you're really seeing is that becoming a more mainstream opinion.
Yeah, the big question is going to be, over the next few days, do former presidents, do members of the U.S. Senate, people like that, come out publicly? And I'm not sure they
Yeah.
will. I think the train is pretty far out of the station. But actually, it's kind of interesting because I think that like I've written Twitter's obituary a lot of times, but I do think you see this really, really centralized political conversation that is just propelling a national narrative here.
Twitter does matter in earthquakes and in presidential debates. This is when we pay attention to Twitter. What
Yeah,
is actually
totally,
fucking
totally.
happening in the country? Now, here's a media strategy question. There's people espousing a version of reality in which Biden is not the candidate come November. But there's also the question of what the media strategy should be. And in my mind, if Biden's going to keep running, isn't there a point of him saying, look, not him, but the media narrative becoming, you're not voting on the person, you're voting on this ship. And so do you want to be on board with Jake Sullivan, John Feiner, Pete Buttigieg, or do you want to be on like a little, Cruz with Trump, Rudy Giuliani, MJT.
It's just not how anybody has voted for president in the last several elections. That would defy it would defy the way that the polls look right now, and
Yeah.
it would defy all recent voting history for presidents. And Americans don't like being told that they actually don't know who's in charge. Biden's team has worked very hard to push back against those kind of conspiracy theories. So
Naeem, I like the idea in some technocratic future, but the morning the press secretary comes out and says that is the afternoon the president resigns.
But I do think that people, they want any reason to vote for Biden, but they do not have one. Many like kind of double haters, young people in this country are looking for that reason. But the debate highlights for me were I didn't have sex with a porn star, Manchurian candidate, and who's going to carry whose bags at the golf course.
It just makes you proud to be American.
It's good television, bad presidential debate.
Oof.
All right, so last thing, predictions. Will there be a second matchup between these two men? And who would win the golf game if played? Max, you go first.
I think that Trump obviously spends a lot more time playing golf, so I think he would have a easier time in that regard. And I don't think that there will be a second one. I know that many news executives are already, including some of those at ABC, are concerned about the possibility that this debate would go in one certain direction, and one of the candidates would want to cancel that. There's precedent for that, and so I'm that's easy money for me.
I actually think there is going to be another debate because Biden is now trapped in a situation where to withdraw from another debate is to withdraw from the race, and he may just have to be kind of wheeled up to the next one too. Brutal.
So it seems like you're not voting for him for the golf game.
I don't
either.
know. Trump notoriously cheats at golf. Who knows?
I'm going to have to take the craziest bet here, which is that there will be a second debate, but it will be between Donald Trump and somebody else.
I love it. I love that kind of New York room, Naima.
I'll take odds on this.
Go breathe some fresh air.
Let's take a quick break. And when we're back, we will play a conversation that we had with a gambler, Nate Silver, and a person who had Donald Trump up before this debate. I'm sure the model will only have him up even more beyond this debate. After the break, Nate Silver will be with us. All right, as people are hearing this, the debate is over, but the polls are just kicking off, and we will be drowning in them till November, and then we will be analyzing them till the end of our lives. A man that we have to blame for that is Nate Silver. He came up as a kind of groundbreaking baseball statistician, a kind of Moneyball character. He also plays a lot of poker. And during the 2008 presidential campaign, he was revealed to have a side hustle in his baseball days. This was as the anonymous blogger Poblano on the progressive site Daily Cause. And Nate then went on to build 538, which he licensed to the New York Times for a while and then sold, I'm sure, for a sizable fortune to ESPN/ABC.
We actually, when I was at BuzzFeed, we actually talked to him about buying it before he sold it to ABC.
What was the price tag?
He never quite got that far, but I think when it became clear to him that it would have been BuzzFeed equity, he decided to go in a different direction.
Seems like he made a good choice.
Wise man.
Nate has since left 538 and started his new Substack, Silver Bulletin. But he's kind of the king of this world.
Yeah, Nate, I think, kind of invented this modern conversation about polling back, as you said, when he was an anonymous blogger. And the thing that is easy to forget back then is that was a year, 2007, 2008, when Obama was really consistently leading in the polls as a national candidate, but there was just Democrats were panicked every day that these polls were concealing an undercurrent of racism in which voters were going to show up and vote against Obama, even though they would tell pollsters they were going to vote for him, something called the Bradley effect. Urban legend actually called the Bradley effect. And Nate's job that cycle is just every day to say, don't worry about it. The polls are correct. Obama's going to win. And there was just nothing more addictive to Democrats than that. Just waking up in the morning, hitting refresh on whichever of Nate's blogs he was on at that moment and being like, is Obama going to win? Yes. And then Democrats could go about their days. And so that made him this really iconic figure in 2008 and then again in 2012, actually. And then to some degree again in 2016 when he went into the election saying, Hillary Clinton's probably going to win.
And I think in that case, it was 25, 27% that Donald Trump would win the election and 70+% that it was going to be Hillary Clinton in 2016. He has this probabilistic model rather than the kind of polling itself. It's not a snapshot in time. Instead, it's looking across the aggregates and it's giving a percentage chance that this person is going to win the election.
The thing that's always driven me a little crazy about Nate is after that election, not wrongly, Trump won and everybody said, the polls were wrong. You guys were wrong. You're all idiots. And Nate said, no, look, I said Trump had a pretty decent chance of winning and he won. And so, all right, I
That's
don't know what you're supposed to do with that.
that's the thing with being a statistician. It has like a built-in hedge, so you can always
Exactly.
be right, but you're like, but I was less right than the other thing I could have said.
Yeah. But he really is. I mean, he really is king of this world. And so much that he has a whole legion of imitators and rivals. I think some of them are also named Nate, which is a little confusing.
Yes, you have referred to some as Nate 1 and Nate 2, but we're not going to say which one's which.
I mean, this is Nate 1.
Nate Silver is definitely a poor Nate Cohn, great journalist at the New York Times. But these days, Nate Silver is a big deal and in the mouth of the former president, Donald Trump, being celebrated by him because Silver Bulletin, which is Nate Silver's Substack, has just unveiled this brand spanking new probabilistic model, which shows a greater than 60% chance of Donald Trump winning the race. By the time people are listening to this, we will have just had this debate. I think that Nate thinks that debates are just like a flashpoint in time and don't really matter to what's going to happen. And so we really want to spin forward this conversation. Like, what's the horse race we're going to see from now till November? What's the signal? What's the noise? What actually matters? And how right or less wrong is he going to be this time around in 2024?
Hi, Nate. Welcome to Mixed Signals.
Hey, Ben, how are you?
I'm so excited to be here because Ben tells me you and he have been fighting on Twitter since its advent, basically.
I feel like we're pretty simpatico. We've both been through like 4 or 5 different media hype cycles, I think.
All right. Well, I'm happy to be here to moderate. We're congratulations on the model, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Has Donald Trump called you yet to sing your praises for showing that he has a slightly better chance of winning this election?
I mean, there was a spam call earlier, right? I mean, it had some Kansas City area code. I don't think he has any properties out there. I don't think he has any casinos out there. So I don't think it was him. But
No.
I'll have to check my voicemail.
Trump Golf Resort, Kansas City is coming. So you just released this model. There's a big debate that by the time people are hearing this has happened. Will the debate matter? Will the debate change your model?
Look, the way I put it is that the debate, one of the 2 remaining debates, is one of the only 2 times that there could be something big that happens, right? I mean, clearly, debates don't make that much impact, but like, if you have a 1-point race in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, a 1-point impact is a big deal. I mean, look, it is interesting that like, if Biden does really badly, having this debate be earlier, which their campaign wanted, it does create this potential, bedwetting meta cycle.
It's a really bad metaphor for this particular debate.
Bedwetting meta cycle. That is so gross.
That is like really.
This potential cycle, we'll just say that, where because the Democratic convention is not until August, Biden could say tomorrow that like, I am choosing, after all, not to run for a second term, and Kamala Harris is my recommendation for the nomination, and the superdelegates in Chicago will determine the different Democratic nominee. He does have that option. Optionality is important in kind of a gambling decision-making context. Any option that you can potentially take, if Biden is really, really badly in the debate, to the point where instead of being down 4 points in Georgia, he's down 7, then at that point, the right rational play, if Democrats care as much as they claim, this is a conditional, this is not a prediction. Democrats do have the option to try and persuade him that, Joe, it's too far gone, it's time to step aside.
We're going to dive into your model in this conversation. But first, we really want to address the distrust that surrounds kind of the entire election. And in some cases, there's a sense of conspiracy around predictions and polling, the media, election coverage writ large. The most insidious version of this conspiracy is kind of that there's no underlying reality, that rather than being a mirror, and this is not specific to you, but the entire industry, right? Like that there's no reality, that rather than being a mirror of what voters' preferences are, that these models are like an invisible hand whereby media mediates these preferences and democracy overall. They tell people when to freak out. They tell campaigns when to pay attention. They drive people's expectations of who's a winner and a loser. And they create this kind of pendulum shift where if you think your candidate is losing, you'll show up. But if they're winning by a wide margin, you'll calm down.
Yeah, I think that's people who spend way too much time on Twitter, right? And you see evidence of, I think, and this is now one consequence of Democrats being kind of the party of college-educated elites, maybe not the financially most off, but like is that they are in an echo chamber. Democrats think that the New York Times being mean to Biden is the biggest reason that he's losing, right? Democrats think that because they hear a lot in their social circles about Israel-Palestine, obviously a tragic situation. But if you poll regular voters, and especially swing voters who are disengaged, like Israel-Palestine and the Quinnipiac poll this week is like literally the lowest priority on the list, I think, except for Trump's criminal convictions, maybe. If you kind of look in reality, first of all, it's not that surprising that Trump is beating a candidate like Biden, as flawed as Trump is as a candidate himself. But look, Biden is 81 years old, is asking to be president until he's 86. This has been a consistent concern in polls, overwhelming concern, even among independents and Democrats for a year or so now. We had very high inflation, which has abated. That's good for Biden. There are issues like immigration, which is higher partly because of pandemic-related fluctuations. All around the world, incumbents are getting crushed. By the way, the most important reason is that we know what happened in 2016, which is that Clinton did win the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, right? Our model actually has Biden as a very slight favorite to win the popular vote again, but almost a 2-to-1 underdog to win the Electoral College, because there's that persistent gap of about 3 points, and that means that you are kind of fighting very uphill. It's like getting 15 yards for a first down instead of 10 if you're the much better offense. Sorry for the sports analogy here.
Before we get back to sports, and sorry, I have to ask you about media. It's obviously really this is about us, and I feel like you kind of like you sort of skipped over Naeema's question a little, which is there is obviously a kind of a feedback loop between polling and real politics. Like the most obvious thing that comes to mind is the way in which the 2019 poll really showing Warren doing terribly against Trump, I think did help shift votes and push her out of the race. And I'm curious how you think about that feedback loop.
I think in multi-candidate primaries, and it's more rational for voters to switch horses, right? If you're indifferent between Bernie and Warren, and one of them seems like they can beat Biden and the other can't, then it's rational to do that. In a two-way race, I'm much less convinced of that. I mean, the empirical evidence of because you hear it both ways. You're like, oh, it's going to suppress Democratic turnout because it makes them depressed. Or you hear, oh, it's going to motivate Democrats because they're not complacent any longer. Look, coverage of polling is a subspecies of media coverage in general. I think having a model that has set rules, right, that is, what it means to be objective is a complicated philosophical question, actually, right? Which mirrors, ironically, I think, some of the debates in media about media objectivity overall.
For sure.
Yes.
But to have a process that you decided on ahead of time, right? This is 98% the same model that had Democrats winning in 2008 and 12 and 16 and 20. It's been a long time now, right? You plug in the same data to the same model, and Trump has a pretty persistent lead in polls, and the polls have been very steady. And so, I think Democrats in general really over-index on kind of blaming the media for everything now.
Why do this? Why put this out into the world and I'd say this is what, what's the impact of it, if not influence? Or
the impact is that you now have more accurate information that you can use to make better decisions in your life, right? Maybe if you don't like Trump and you want to apply for some foreign visa in Canada or something now, then you know that you probably should take that pretty seriously. Or maybe you're trying to hedge risk in the stock market because you think Trump will cause inflation, or maybe you're just on an offshore betting site. My audience is not the political audience. This is what I've realized. It's like, I do not like the political class of people. I like poker players. I like
these days,
Wall
some of
Street
them
and
don't
Silicon
like
Valley.
you either, Nate.
Yeah, and it's mutual because I'm cut from a different cloth from them, right?
Didn't you like them better when they liked you? There was this era when Democrats would wake up every morning and say, "Oh my God, is Obama still winning?" And they would go to you and you would say yes, and they loved you.
Empirically, I never loved them back.
But back then, you were hired at the Times. There was a bit of kerfuffle. You had said that you voted for Obama, right? And you showed your card. So at the time, you were part of, not necessarily the class, but you were in that party, right, for the moment. So how does it feel to go from being a darling to being, at odds with?
I think if I do my job well, it's inevitable. And journalists sometimes say, well, if both sides are angry at you, then you're doing your job right, which is a cliche that I don't entirely or mostly don't agree with, right? However, if you're in the specific enterprise of making election forecasts, look, I would be a total hack if all of a sudden my model said, oh yeah, forget the polls, something fundamental has changed, and now ignore the fact that Joe Biden is down 6 points in this Quinnipiac poll that comes out, or 4 points in the Georgia poll, or whatever else. Ignore the fact that nothing has moved the numbers, right? That's what would terrify me if I were in the White House. It's he's not that far behind. It's just nothing has changed the race, and voters have dealt with the same candidates now for 5 years, literally. Trump now 3 times in a row. So what's gonna change this? I mean, fortunately for the White House, they're close enough that if you have another one of these systematic polling errors, they could win. It wouldn't have to be that large an error, but it's a narrow path. The election it reminds me of a lot is 2012, where the national polls were tight as they are this year, but Obama had consistently more robust polling in the swing states. They were very consistent.
The other thing in 2012 was there was a little cottage industry of, as you recall, I think unskewing the polls, right?
Yeah,
There was a set of Republicans who just felt like this can't be true, and we're going to kind of go into the math and tweak a little here, tweak a little there, which I think people like you and me mocked. And I believe after the election, some of the big unskewers sort of apologized, maybe to you personally. But how do you see Democrats responding? Is it a mirror image of that? Is it something different?
yeah. I think that epistemology, to use the fancy term, of Democratic poll watchers is a little bit. I was one of these people who thought naively, because of that experience in 2012, I thought naively that like Republicans uniquely suffered from epistemic closure, and now it's clear that like Democrats do just as much. If anything, the unskewing is like, because their audience is like more college educated, it's like more elaborate versions of lying to yourself. The polling overall was very accurate in 2022. So after 2022, it's like this is about as well as polls can do, and if people still blame the polls and make up this whole narrative, whereas in contrast, in 2016 and 2020, the polls did have a clear skew, and it was a skew against Trump, right? Like that, where 2020 in particular, like Biden won, so people don't blame the polls as much in 2016. In 2020, Biden was up like, 8 points in some of these states, like Wisconsin wound up winning by a point or so. That was a bad polling error, and it didn't favor Democrats. And so it's absolutely right that like the error distribution on polls is like larger than people assume. But you can't predict which direction it's going to go. I mean, the media was guilty in 2022 of assuming that, we're going to have another Democratic skew, and we didn't.
Right. I want to make sure that, like, by the way, we've gone deep down in this conversation. I just want to pull
Yeah.
up for a second because, yes, the polls were wrong in 2016, as you point out, also wrong in 2020, though Democrats don't like to talk about that as much because they were wrong in the quote right way for them, I think, as you're saying. But now in 2024, you have just released this new presidential election model, which shows Trump with a 66% chance of winning the election. And that made a lot of news, which I'm sure pleased you. It surprised a lot of people. I'm curious if it surprised you. And I'm curious if you say the model is like 98% what you used to have in 538, which 538 right now no longer owned by you under ABC.
Yeah.
That poll at 538 is showing Biden up. And you're saying this is 98% the same model.
No, it's not, because
Yeah.
I should just clarify.
Yeah.
I owned all the IP
Mm-hmm.
for 538 because I had a good lawyer when I signed with Disney.
This is one of the
12
great
years
media
ago.
coups, Nate, for
Yeah.
real.
Yeah, so I kept all the IP, and they hired a new guy to create a model that has nothing to do with mine. So,
Got it. Okay.
They own the trade name 538. They own the 5e Fox mascot, I think. But this is the same model that has been the most accurate model, the way that we judge it, which is whether
Got
the
it.
probabilities align, right? That you're supposed to like, in some cosmic multiverse, Biden is supposed to win this election 35% of the time, despite being an underdog. And, and 0.001% of the time, RFK Jr. sometimes wins or whatever else, and Trump wins 65%. But
Right.
like, yeah.
So like if there were 100 such elections, then Trump would win 66 of them and Biden would win 34 of them.
Right. Again, this is like the gambler's mentality, right?
Right.
In 2016, our model, or my model, I should say, to avoid confusion now, my model had Trump with a 30% chance, and that was much higher than the betting market odds, right? So if you were using our model, you would actually put a pretty large wager on Trump, even though you expect to lose that 70% of the time. The odds you're getting are so good that it's what I would call plus EV, or positive expected value. I know it seems totally foreign to like people in the politics world to think this way, but that's the world that I come from. I was a professional poker player
Yeah.
before I started covering politics. I'm an experienced like sports bettor. I just wrote a whole book about gambling, and it's actually like a pretty big world of people who think like me and not like the political class, and they subscribe to the newsletter and like the podcast and things like that. And
Yeah.
it's very freeing not to have to like coddle people and say, I mean, look, the fact is that Biden is in a fair amount of trouble. And I think people are being too polite about it. And by the way, this is also a case where the decision to run again was certainly not obvious. I mean, a lot of Democrats in Congress assume that Biden wouldn't run again. He never pledged to be one-termer. He did not do that, but he kind of set him a bridge and made that implication sometimes,
Right.
right? So this is a decision where Democrats would have had the option, and now it would be kind of insane, to be fair, right? But
Is it
when it became
impossible?
clear,
Is it impossible in your?
no, it's not until August, whatever the final date of the convention is, or no, it's not impossible. I mean, and look, to pull the emergency lever is obviously an insane thing to do, but the question is it less insane than walking into an election where you're a 2-1 underdog? And by the way, I want Joe Biden to win. I said that in the article. I'm not a Trump guy at
Yeah.
all, right? But I have experience because you have to do this in poker. In poker, if you take a bad beat, you can't then mope and lose the next hand and tilt off. You have to like actually kind of understand that like our emotions, especially for like smart people who are very, very good at like rationalizing, they're the worst about it, right?
And now, like, liberated in your new reality, no longer bound by the ethical standards of the New York Times or ABC newsrooms, how much money do you have on the race?
I have none personally. I disclose I do a consulting deal with a financial firm, and they may be making bets based on their conversations with me.
Why aren't you? Is that
Yeah.
that a lack of confidence?
Because I don't need the money, and because I would want to hedge my risk if anything. Like it's better for me.
Right.
Financially, it's better for me if the favorite in the model probably wins, and so I'm not looking to like pile onto that. I think the financial implications are significant of that.
Right. Maybe you should bet the actually, right. You should bet the opposite.
Yeah, that's a decent argument.
Yeah. You should hedge.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There's often I feel like there is that funny "the polls were wrong" thing that is it's always sort of overserved, isn't it? I wonder why. I actually don't really have a theory on why that is. I'm curious if you do the sort of desire to think that the polls were wrong.
I mean, I think it's partly because, when we're confronted with objective facts, and I'm aware, Ben, that objectivity is a complicated concept.
No, but I
like,
mean retrospectively, like there's this sort of myth that the 2016 polling, for instance, was wildly off.
Yeah. 2016 was not great, but not terrible, right? I don't know. I mean,
But it's a binary outcome, right? Like, what does it mean to be not terrible? Like, it means nothing to voters who are voting one way or another to be left and right wrong.
take this from the opposite point of view. Oh, Biden is behind in all the swing states. He's been behind for months. It's hopeless. No, it's not, because the polls can be wrong. He has actually a 35% chance. Not bad at all, right? It's a pretty good. That's a pretty good shot. It's an NBA three-pointer or something, right?
I like this new sort of liberated version of you who's talking to people who understand statistics and is tired of people who don't understand statistics.
Mhm.
But if I can ask one other sort of possibly annoying question for you, I do think the other thing that I don't, at least what I do when I look at polls is, immediately sort of look into the crosstabs and then often say like, this doesn't make any sense. What's your remedy for that?
I think you should look at crosstabs as being about as accurate as astrology. But there's a reason for it.
Are you into astrology, Nayeema?
I actually believe the world is divided into people with 12 types based on the month of their birth. But we should also explain for a moment, like crosstabs are looking at very specific voter demographics. So like Biden down 7 points with Gen Z or Trump getting up with 35% with Black voters, et cetera.
Yeah. So what happens is that you might have a poll that has 1,000 respondents, which has a margin of error of 3.5%. But then you slice and dice it kind of literally into like 10 or 12 crosstabs. African American women might be 50 people in that poll if they're representative of the population, and that has a margin of error of like 18 points or something like that. Just trying to estimate it offhand, or like, and if you have 20 random sequences anchored around some truth, right? But like, if you're basically like drawing a bunch of lottery tickets with small sample sizes, you're going to have some that create weird patterns, and so. Like, this is for, the term midwit. Now I'm really getting a little spicy. I didn't have a lot of
No, do it.
Do it. Right? We love spice.
I don't even know that term.
Midwit is for people who are educated up to a point, but like actually just overcomplicate things, right?
Like people who think they know more than they know.
Yeah, or the Dunning-Kruger or whatever. Am I pronouncing that right? I'm probably Dunning-Kruger myself. But like, look at the top line of the poll and look at the quality of the outfit doing the poll and look at their track record. The New York Times Siena College polls have been excellent polls. They got a lot of things right in recent midterms, like 2018 and 2022, that a lot of pollsters didn't. The fact that they show Biden losing all these swing states and yet show Democrats doing well among these high turnout voters that vote in congressional elections. I mean, that's a pretty dispositive piece of evidence, I think. Yeah, look, if it were a matter of like, oh, the crappy pollsters show Trump winning and the good pollsters show Biden winning, that would be I think a credible kind of unskewing type argument, but that's not what we see. I mean, if anything, the better polls show Biden doing worse.
I have to ask, like, Why do we need all of these polls done at every single minute? There are literally over, I think I read somewhere there are 1,500 polls that we will have between now and November. And it was a couple months back, so maybe there's like 1,300, great glory. But is there a time when we actually know the answer?
No, we don't. Because, okay, so there's one thing. We're not, it's not like we're going to zoom to like, Trump is 65% now. Let's say nothing more changes and he maintains this like, 2-point lead in Pennsylvania and whatever, right? It's not going to go to 100% by election day. But no, I agree though. I am sympathetic to the notion that like we don't need as many polls as we have. I think it's probably right. I mean, because if you look at it, I mean, the irony is if you look at the more robust averages, I mean, the New York Times has one now, or the Washington Post has one. I think ours is pretty good. They're actually very steady, right? So it's almost like you don't need all these polls. Now, look, when Trump gets convicted on felony charges, or you have a debate, or he picks his VP, or after the conventions, But yeah, I mean, yeah, if we just had a big set of polls like 7 times a year, you have a designated like polling weekend or something like that would be perfectly fine and would give you most of the information that you need.
Or maybe we need to be more French. By that, I don't mean like have a snap election that might put Marine Le Pen in power, but to have a bit of a blackout period of campaign advertising coverage, the way France does, where there's just like a weekend right before the election.
Give everybody a second to think.
Yeah, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing. I think it probably would violate the First Amendment here. But the games that pollsters play in that last weekend anyway, I tend to think that's when there's a lot of ass covering and a lot of what we call herding, where they don't want to be seen as like the outlier.
So you're saying these things aren't totally objective?
Yeah.
No, I think science is hard. I mean, look at the replication crisis, right? Look at in academia how like most scientific studies are bad. I think polling is actually a relatively rigorous technique, but one reason why pollsters did have a good 2022 is that they figured out that the classic technique of just literally randomly dialing people in the phone book and hoping to get a representative sample doesn't work in a world where like 8% of people respond to surveys. So instead, these are basically little mini models, and my model kind of averages these models. And like modeling is tricky. Modeling requires domain knowledge. It requires making a lot of subjective choices. And that's why you have, the Economist forecast has Trump at 72% or something, and the new 538 has him at 49%, and I have him at 66 or 65 or whatever. These are all reasonable people making these forecasts, and you have dozens of choices to make with the way you build a model. What you don't want to have happen is when a pollster declines to report a result because they self-censor, and that's I think been made worse by the mobs on Twitter, where like you're like, oh, this poll's terrible. Of course, Biden's not losing by 12 points in Wisconsin or whatever. And so that can create suppression of useful evidence, which has had effects sometimes.
It's like a free speech argument. That's so interesting.
That's interesting. I think we came in sort of asking about the way in which the discourse and the public conversation is driven by polling, but actually in a way it's the opposite, right? Pollsters are at risk of being driven by the discourse.
For sure. Yeah, because like it's a pretty brave thing to do. I mean, look, my former employer, ABC News, had a poll in Wisconsin in late October 2020 that had Biden up 17 points in Wisconsin. And they were brave to publish that because they probably knew it was going to be wrong. The average in Wisconsin did overrate Biden, but had him up by like 6 or whatever. 17 is a big outlier. But they believed in the kind of process of polling. And now you're seeing less of that. And that could lead to, some big surprises sooner or later. Maybe Trump wins by 10 points, though. I mean, that's the thing. It could go. The surprises don't always go in the nice way that you're hoping for as a reader.
If your model still has Trump, with better odds, close to election night, and he ends up winning, will you be celebrating being right or sad that the person you voted for didn't win the election?
I mean, in that sense, my risks are well hedged, right? And if you want kind of a more complicated answer, it might depend on things like which party controls Congress, who Trump's vice president is.
I wanted a less complicated answer, Nate.
I'll take the fifth. Because I don't know how I'll feel. And it depends too on like the narrative of the election. I mean, it could be that like by the time we get to the election, that Biden's back in front in the model or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I gave you a hypothetical.
Right. There's a real lose-lose for you here.
Yeah.
Biden's in front and Trump wins, then you got to move to Canada. Just a shame, honestly.
No, I've already won. I think I've already won by like building a successful newsletter product and having an interesting time intellectually trying to figure out how to forecast this election. I'm doing this because of the rewards along the way, right? Mm-hmm. If I were just sitting forward to election day, like most of those outcomes are bad for me. most of the time, people are mad at me either because Trump wins and I said he'd win, they'll still be mad at me, or because Biden wins and I was probabilistically wrong. We can debate what that means. So it's going to end in tears no matter what. But along the way, I collect
You collect $200 when you pass go. Yeah.
I collect a subscriber base who does understand what I'm thinking. Like seriously, that's
Yeah.
why I'm doing
Yeah.
it. We got offers to go to some network or something and do this, and I am only doing this because I believe in the subscriber newsletter
Mhm.
model, right? Because that is a way to kind
Yeah.
of self-identify the people that are going to get you.
Well, you're talking to your people. I mean, I
Yeah.
remember when we
Right.
were talking when I was at BuzzFeed, and there was a different moment for you, and you were like, "Look, I just gotta like maximize my return in this particular moment of my life." So I'm kind of glad that you're maximizing your satisfaction here, however strange that is, Nate. Honestly,
I
It's true.
mean, it's not. This is what I mean. In some ways, like the gamblers are more normal. They kind of have very normy politics a lot of the time, or at least they're kind of eccentrically normal or something like that. You go to Vegas, that's a real cross section of America.
For sure it is. That's true. All right. Well, thank you so much, Nate, for being with us.
really, thanks for doing this, Nate.
Thank you. It was really fun, guys.
Nate won. What a character.
Yeah, man knows his own mind.
He does not seem like he is at all upset about upsetting anyone.
He's always sort of loved trolling in a way, but I do think
Mhm.
he now, to some degree, like thrives on annoying people who he believes don't understand probability.
Midwits.
Midwits.
Are we midwits?
I believe so. Where you can, if you want, just talk to the people you feel really get you. That's a viable financial model. In a way, he was at the opposite end, which was talking to random viewers of ABC News, and it's possible that he did not feel totally understood by those good people.
I don't know. It was very interesting to me because when he described his mission, there was like this public service to it. It wasn't just, oh, I want to do the math really well and get the math right. There was part of that, right? I'm like doing this thing, and this is just what the thing is. You can tell me like you don't like it, but I'm telling you the sky is blue, right? So there's a bit of that he has. And at the same time, it's like, I'm just trying to give people information and make like micro decisions in their lives. If you like Trump or not, if you're going to move to Canada or move to the United States. And I thought that was really insightful, actually, like this public service mission to the ordinary voter.
He really, I think, has been kind of scarred through his career by and really rejects the premise that the polls are shaping reality. Like, I think he obviously just finds that incredibly irritating, although maybe he'll grant that occasionally in primaries it's true. And in fact, I think the thing that was so interesting to me is that to him, the risk is that the pollsters are bullied by particularly people on social media getting mad at them and shift their perceptions of reality. I think he's built a real kind of like carapace to resist what he sees as, pressure on him to provide to tell people what they want to hear.
Yeah, but this is like part of the broader critique of kind of cancel culture and like the concern of free speech, right? The Elon Musk warriors of the world. Like this is a Silicon Valley kind of argument you hear where it's like, we're not allowed to say the thing. We're not allowed to say the thing anymore. Do you think that there's some truth in that in polling or political coverage?
Oh, yeah, and I think the subtler version of it is just that you wanna give the paying customer what they wanna hear. Not so much that you're gonna be canceled, but just that the market incentives are like, there's gotta be somebody out there right now saying, "Don't worry, Joe Biden's gonna win," because there's a market for that.
That's a really challenging perspective as commercial as the business of media is, like in a business that's oriented towards truth, democracy dies in the darkness, et cetera. The idea of like kind of catering to your customer is not the mission of the organization.
Not of ours, and I think,
No.
and I guess our belief is that, you earn trust over time, and if you say crazy stuff and it proves to be untrue, that people will stop believing you, although it is
Yeah.
also just worth noting that in, like, the literature of doomsday cults, they never lose steam after doomsday doesn't happen. People only grow more committed, so I don't know,
Right.
I guess Nate probably sees himself as a realist on this point. Like, I love that he refused to say whether he would be happy if he was right and Donald Trump won.
Yeah, I know. It was so interesting. I think you would be happy if you were
Depends on
right,
some
but
of
it
the down
depends on the
ballot
day.
races, yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a very complicated answer.
Unique American character.
Meanwhile, extremely important, as Ali, our producer, was saying, she was just imagining Donald Trump refreshing the feed every minute. Says, "Is it out yet? Is it out yet?" Does that
What does
Nate
Nate
Silver?
Silver think?
What does
Yeah.
Nate Silver of the New York Times
He
think?
really has personally reshaped how people think about polling, think about
Yeah,
politics in America. It's pretty amazing.
but yet, he's saying he's not changing the outcomes. He's just telling you how it's going to be.
Yeah, and it is also true that if and when Joe Biden wins, he'll say, "Well, I told you it was pretty likely."
All right, let's take a quick break and we'll be back for Blind Spots.
This week on our branded segment from Think with Google, I talked with Josh Spanier about AI's impact on the creative industries and about just how worried ad creatives should be about their jobs. Josh, just down the street here, your colleague Vidya Srinivasan, Google's VP of Ads, just talked about how this business is entering an AI era. What will the rise of AI mean for people and for businesses?
So I'm thinking about it very specifically for the marketing process. We need insights. We need insights to make our marketing relevant to people like you and to people in the world so they actually discover and use our products. So I was speaking with McDonald's yesterday and they found these insight, in part using AI, that kids love going to McDonald's with grandmothers because the grandmothers will treat them to the McFlurry that they always want, where their regular parents may not do so.
I always suspected that.
So they actually turned that into a whole campaign, really cleverly done, inspired by insights that derive from AI. We're also looking at creativity. So we run many campaigns across Google Marketing, and we're using generative AI to actually scale that across all these platforms to actually create hundreds and hundreds of variations of ads which make them more relevant and more engaging, and actually do so in a way which actually is scalable that previously we couldn't do. And it leads to better business outcomes, and actually our creative teams really enjoy it because they can express different ideas in different ways and get to market quicker, and along the way, measurement and accountability. Every CFO, every financial organization wants to know that the dollars you're putting in, you're getting dollars more out. With AI, we're actually speeding up the ability to measure our programs, and we're using a lot of Google Analytics and Google AI to actually prove that we actually are getting the value from these campaigns along the way. At every stage in the process, AI is actually making us smarter, it's making us faster, and it's actually making us more creative along the journey.
Today we're doing something a little different, a little more global, and unfortunately a little less Max Tani for Blind Spots. He's traveling at the moment. But we have been so consumed with elections in the United States that we think it's worth casting a light at the broader, to use cable TV terms, Decision 2024 around the world, where more than 60 countries that represent almost half of the world's population have or will head to the polls this year.
I'm a little skeptical of this segment, Nayeema.
Why, Ben? Because you're like an American isolationist, an exceptionalist.
No,
You don't want to know about the rest of the world.
very global. I love the Semafor Global Election Hub, which is a place you can find all this stuff. I just don't want this to be a sort of eat your spinach thing. I've never bought the idea that sort of the job of media was to lecture people about things that they were supposed to care about.
Don't worry, Ben. This is going to be a don't eat your spinach, but kind of beware of what might be on your menu in 2024 in November in the United States, because sometimes outcomes around the world, they give you some indicators of where the mood is, where the vibes are, let's say. And that was
Yeah.
the case with Brexit and Donald Trump in 2016.
No, and it's really one of the great blind spots of American media, actually, this notion that you can try to explain, in this case, the rise of the populist right in an American context, and when
Yeah.
it's such a global story.
Exactly. So already this year, we've seen major elections in Mexico, where they've elected the country's first Jewish president, a woman. South Africa, where the ANC struggled. Cyril was able to hold on to power, but ANC struggled. India, where Modi held on to power, but actually lost seats in the parliamentary elections, although he would not necessarily admit any defeat. Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah, somewhere the Nate
President Modi.
Silver of India is telling people, "I told you so," because his model said that there was a 4% chance that Modi would lose this badly.
That's true. And then in Pakistan, in Indonesia, in Pakistan, the prime minister held on to his seat, and there were kind of country descended into protests and claims of rigged election led by allies of the former prime minister and current prisoner Imran Khan. And in Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto won. Do you know who that is, Ben?
I don't.
Prabowo is the son-in-law. He's the country's former defense minister and someone I know a little bit. I grew up in Indonesia when his father-in-law, Suharto, was ousted from power in the late
But
90s.
was this a very elaborate way to get to a name drop?
No, don't worry. If this was a name drop, my flex would not be Prabowo Subianto.
Kind of
That would
impressive.
be great.
We got to have him on if he wins.
Prabowo Subianto, who is the country's defense minister, who was for a long time on the human rights like persona non grata list for his actions in East Timor, might still be actually, but he was the son-in-law of President Suharto, and it's kind of a nostalgia in Indonesia, but also around the world for a dictatorship of the past. Like these countries have experimented with democracy. It hasn't necessarily proved out that much better for them. And you saw this in places like Libya. You've seen this in Indonesia, where people want like the sons and son-in-laws of dictators back in power.
Marcos is back in the Philippines. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something happening. And then around the world, on the heels of this episode, there's some pretty big elections happening in France, where after the far right swing in the EU parliamentary elections, Macron has made a very risky bet. He's called for this polarizing snap election that many think could hand the country to Marine Le Pen and the far right.
Man loves to roll the dice. I mean, incredible story, actually. I mean, I actually have covered him a little, interviewed him once, and it is every reporter's dream to cover somebody who loves to gamble as much as Macron loves to gamble. Like, he loves to gamble more than Nate Silver loves to
We should
gamble.
introduce Nate Silver and Macron. They could like go to a little betting table together in Vegas.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I do think that the French media right now is really kind of reeling and scrambling to prepare for what they believe, based on the polling in that country, is likely to be a takeover by a far right that, among other things, is traditionally quite hostile in some ways to journalism, particularly to the public media, and into the journalists that have investigated what used to be called the National Front for a long time. I was in Paris last week and visited the Office of Reporters Sans Frontières, which is a great
Mhm.
crusading journalism organization whose executive director, Christophe Deloire, tragically died recently. And there was a big wreath of flowers that
Oh, yeah.
from Macron and from Madame Macron sitting there in the entryway. And I
Yeah.
was with a very prominent French journalist who took a look at that and said, "Ah, well, when I die, I hope that the president and Monsieur Le Pen will send flowers." And then everyone was like, "They're not going to send flowers." So
They're not gonna send flowers to journalists. Another place where they are not probably gonna be sending any flowers to journalists is Iran, where presidential elections are gonna be held on the day that we're releasing this episode, Friday, after the unexpected death of Ibrahim Raisi in the helicopter crash last month. This is like a very look, ultimately, regardless of who wins, we know that the real power in that country rests with the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, but it is an important election to see where the country is going. This is a country who is, embattled in a lot of proxy wars, including a very important one to the US. And so that will be an important election to pay attention to. And then on July 4th, as the Americans celebrate their independence from the Brits, the UK will be holding a general election. And it looks like Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the Tories are expected to be voted out after so many years, and the Labour Party taking power for the first time since 2010.
And I think when you're looking at sort of storylines and
Mhm.
the opportunity to see that, to try to look to the future in other countries, I mean, I think that's what Macron is looking to, and to some degree what U.S. Democrats are looking to, which is, all right, let the right take over, let them do something like Brexit, and in Britain, really, I think, prove that they were unable to govern, or at least most of the populace left thinking, God, these clowns cannot govern, and really get wiped out. And that's what Macron's hoping for in France, I think, is that if the right comes in, they will quickly show themselves unfit. I'm not sure that's going to happen. And I think that's what Democrats thought had happened with Donald Trump, but does not seem to
Yeah.
have.
Well, I don't know. There's a couple ways to look at these elections if we think there's any kind of crystal ball in them, and I don't know that there is. But one is to say, look, the Brits are ahead of the curve. The pendulum shifted all the way, and now it's coming back. And maybe Americans will have that too, right? The pendulum shifted to Trump, and now it has come back. And will it stay back, or will it go the way of what we're seeing in so many of these countries, where the incumbents, even people as powerful as Modi, are losing seats? There's like kind of this anti-incumbent fervor, and people are upset across the globe around many of the same things, which is like they are pissed off about the economy. They don't trust the media or institutions that much. There are real conversations about gender and family that are happening across the world right now, including in the United States, but all over the world. Like the role of men is a big issue in elections in places like India, even. And then the kind of anti outsider perspective, right? Like the immigration, ethnicity, et cetera, like the kind of real populist dynamics are playing out. So a crazy global election year. Was it too much spinach, Ben?
Probably, but I do think that, like, it's a useful. I don't know, that if you're getting sick of looking at the polls and just staring into the sort of furor of the U.S. election, a good way to understand it is to look and read around the world, listen to podcasts around the world, things like that.
And pay attention to what was that thing at Semafor you wanted to plug,
Oh,
Ben?
and do pay attention to the Semafor Global Election Hub, which basically does this with a good amount of voice and insight and concision.
That's the best way to eat your spinach, I'm told. voice and concision. All right. Thank you for listening to Mixed Signals from Semafor Media. Our show is produced by Max Tani, Allison Rogers, Alan Haverchak, Sheena Ozaki, Benji Sarlin, and Andrea Lopez Cruzado. With special thanks to Britta Galanis, Chad Lewis, Rachel Oppenheim, Anna Pizzino, Garrett Wiley, and Jules Zern. Our engineer is Fernando Arruda. Our theme music is by Billy Libby. And our public editor is who? The Spinach Lobby?
Maybe it's Alistair Campbell this week. We're looking at Britain.
What? You just have such a crush on Alistair Campbell. You want it to be
Alistair,
him.
yeah. I suppose I do. The rest is politics.
Okay, stop plugging other podcasts, Ben.
Sorry.
Our public editor is The House, and The House always wins, they say. If you like Mixed Signals, please follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like us, give us a starry review.
And if you're watching YouTube, give us a like and subscribe to Semafor's channel.
And if I were Max Tani, I would tell you to tune in for the Semafor Media newsletter.
Out every Sunday night. Sign up.
So I'll tell you to tune in to Max Tani's Twitter. It's great.